The Israelis carry out fresh massacres in Gaza as the Palestinian body count climbs to 572. The Palestinian resistance kills another 15 enemy combatants, bringing the total to 35 Israeli soldiers dead and 1 captured. The top Hamas official Ismail Haniyeh says that the aim of the current battle is to break the 7-year-old Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip. And talk of a compromise. Diplomatic efforts to end the Israeli aggression on Gaza are stepped up. Hello there, you're watching AEE TV World News and I'm Fatima Basim. It's been 2 weeks since the start of the Israeli aggression against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Israeli warplanes and artillery fire are continuing to pound the besieged enclave, raising the death toll to a staggering 572. We have to warn our viewers that some may find the following images disturbing. This footage obtained by AEE TV captures the aftermath of the latest Israeli massacre against Palestinian civilians living in the Gaza Strip. At least 12 people, including 6 children, were killed and 45 others wounded in the neighborhood of Omar al-Mukhtar when an Israeli attack targeted the Al-Salam building. In the deadliest assault of the day, which left 27 Palestinians dead, Israeli occupation forces bombarded residential areas in the cities of Rafah and Khan Yunis. 13 of these casualties belonged to the same family, most of whom were women and children. Meanwhile, the Israeli policy of indiscriminate shelling on the Gaza Strip has made way for an attack on a hospital in Deir al-Balah, which killed 5 people. Balsam Al-Atrash has the story.
The Israeli offensive against Palestinians in Gaza is becoming grislier by the day. This is the latest target of the Israeli artillery, Shuhada al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah. The shells tore through the surgery department and in the intensive care unit on the 2nd floor, as well as the administration department 1 floor above. The aftermath: 5 dead Palestinians and at least 20 others injured. Eyewitnesses spoke of the panic that ensued while the medical staff said that the shelling was heavy and indiscriminate.
We were working in peace. Then the Israeli army have destroyed our hospital and our departments. Several departments have been destroyed completely. A member of our team and our employees and our colleagues have been injured directly. Female employees, nurses and doctors have been injured directly during work.
For hundreds of others, the hospital became the latest place that they had to abandon. Countless Gaza residents sought shelter at the medical facility in the last few days, hoping that the hospital would not be targeted. They were wrong. And as many slept, the explosions sent concrete and brick raining down on their heads, sending people running for their lives.
We need peace. We need a place to offer this service. This is a human service. We are doctors, nurses here. We are performing a civilian job. We are not army. We are not soldiers here.
The biggest problem now is the painful task of evacuating patients, facing the doctors and the civil defense rescue teams. Appealing for international support, the hospital is begging for the Red Cross and other committees to help evacuate the patients and rescue them before they die.
Civilians simply doing their daily work. Balsam Al-Atrash reporting for AEE TV, Shuhada al-Aqsa Hospital here in Gaza.
Let's now cross over to the Gaza Strip where Balsam is standing by for us. Balsam, tell us more about the latest massacre in Omar al-Mukhtar neighborhood. We saw the very disturbing footage just a moment ago. What's the latest death toll?
The latest death toll, according to the health ministry, is 561 Palestinians killed so far on the 14th day of the Israeli offensive against Gaza, and over 3,500 have been injured. The latest massacre left around 13 Palestinians killed and over 25 injured. The latest hit was on a residential tower in Omar al-Mukhtar neighborhood. It is a civilian neighborhood crowded with residents and civilians. The Israeli artillery struck the building with around 3 artillery shells, which led to the complete destroy of 4 floors from 6 floors of the building. The medical teams were rescuing the injured and wounded victims when the building suddenly collapsed over the medical teams and other people on the street passing by, which led to more deaths among the Palestinians. Killed so far are 13 from this attack alone. 8 of them are children.
What about the Israeli soldiers killed in an ambush east of Khan Yunis today? How many are they?
Yes, 4 Israeli soldiers were killed in an ambush today, eastern Khan Yunis, particularly in Al-Qarara area, where Nasser Salah ad-Din brigades and Al-Qassam brigades performed a joint operation, an ambush where they surprised the enemy with fires and rockets, which led to the death of 4 Israeli soldiers. Another operation was performed eastern Shijaiya, where according to Al-Qassam brigades, around 20 Israeli soldiers were injured and 10 others were killed. The enemy media did not confirm this, but Al-Qassam brigades said that 10 Israeli soldiers were killed eastern Shijaiya. Also in the area, also clashes occurred between the resistance groups and the Israeli troops, leading to several injuries among the Israelis. Now, the random and heavy shelling by the Israeli tanks and artillery also indicate that there might be a large number of casualties among the Israelis, which led them to implement such barbaric attack on the Palestinian residents.
Yes, and what areas are occupation forces mostly focusing their attacks? Because it seems all their attacks are targeting civilians.
Well, it seems like the Israeli occupation forces have no target at all except civilians, women, children, and elderly, residential buildings, civilian buildings as well. They seem just to fire artillery tanks randomly and heavily towards the building without even aiming a target. They claim that they are targeting tunnels and resistance groups, where actually all they target are civilians.
And has international aid been able to reach those in need?
Actually, humanitarian aid, Red Crescent Committee, other humanitarian organizations are not being able to manage some of the locations where there are still Palestinian victims. Shijaiya neighborhood still cannot be entered fully, and doctors expect at least 40 victims to be under the rubble, but they cannot evacuate them just yet. Also in areas like Zanna, in Khan Yunis, and in Rafah as well, there are areas banned from these international and humanitarian organizations to enter in order for them to provide help for the victims. Here in Al Shifa Hospital, the morgues are full with bodies. They pile the bodies on the floor waiting for the Palestinian officials to come and bury them. Today, actually, the Israeli soldiers seems like they were so desperate that they hit a graveyard also as well, while the medical teams were burying some of the Palestinian victims from Shijaiya neighborhood.
Give us a sense of the morale in Gaza at the moment. What are Palestinians hoping for?
Well, Palestinians firstly are happy about the capture of the Israeli soldier. The Israeli soldier is their card for negotiation now with the enemy in order for the international world and the Israeli enemy to negotiate on lifting the siege and stopping the offensive against Gaza. Clearly, the Palestinians here are resisting, fighting, holding on through this offensive. Actually, the Israeli occupation forces implement offensive anyway, even without any soldier being captured. So this time they feel a sense of victory with the resistance groups fighting aggressively against the occupation and even managing to kill some of the Israeli soldiers, and the capture one is a major victory and a major accomplishment for the resistance here in Gaza. For the first time, they have proven to be good and professional in the battlefield, and showed their capabilities for the enemy in order for nobody to take them for granted.
All right, thank you for giving us the latest in Gaza. Bulletin, our correspondent there. Hundreds of Palestinians marched in funeral processions across Gaza as they mourned the deaths of more than 100 civilians killed in Israeli raids overnight. Family, there were no relatives left to mourn after an Israeli attack killed all 28 members from the Abu Jam'a family.
We heard a very loud noise after sunset. We ran here and found citizens buried under their houses. More than 27 were martyred and many more were injured.
4 stories came down without any warning. They were all found in a hole. God help us. We ask all Arab countries to help us and rescue us from this unlawful Israeli occupation.
Well, as Israeli attacks intensify, tens of thousands of Palestinians are fleeing their homes. While some have taken shelter at UN installations across the Gaza Strip, where supplies are dire, others are living on the streets.
Palestinians are leaving their homes in the tens of thousands, some by foot and others piling into the backs of trucks and sitting on the hoods of cars, filled with families trying to get away.
We don't know where to go. We don't know where to get out. This is a conspiracy against us. We are traveling as homeless. We've been walking from Beit el-Hanun. We don't know where we are going. We are going to try and look for a place to sit. There is nowhere to stay. All the houses are destroyed.
According to the UN, 81,000 people are looking for a safe haven, leaving some with nowhere to go but the streets. Many have taken shelter at the UN RWA school in Gaza City, which is struggling with the influx of people.
We are fasting and being patient, sleeping without blankets. We want to go back to our homes safely. For a family of 10, how can we get them clothes? They need food, diapers and milk. The UNRWA is providing for 1 or 2 individuals. But what about whole families? I have 11 individuals. Can they provide me with 11 blankets? No, they can't.
We slept on floor tiles yesterday, but even with all their efforts, all the efforts of the Israeli occupation forces, we will have patience. Even if we have to sleep on the floor, we will continue to fast in all circumstances.
The reality, however, is that these installations only have relief supplies in stock for about 35,000 people. While UNRWA has announced an emergency action plan and an appeal to raise $60 million, many are wondering if those efforts will be little more than a drop in the ocean, as the Israeli attacks on civilians only get worse.
While Palestinian resistance factions are striking back against the Israeli brutality. Hamas's military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, ambushed Israeli occupation forces east of the Al-Shuja'iyya neighborhood, killing 10 soldiers. While east of Khan Yunis, another 5 were reported killed, bringing the total number of dead Zionist troops to 35. This footage released by the Al-Qassam brigades shows the Israeli contingent of troops belonging to the so-called elite Golani forces. 20 of those soldiers were killed earlier on Sunday, the single deadliest day for occupation troops in years. Several other clips were released by the group confirming the deaths of Zionist soldiers. Meanwhile, resistance factions fired scores of rockets, more than 117 of which have landed in occupied territories since this morning. Following the news that an Israeli soldier had been captured by the resistance, celebration erupted across Palestinian cities. In Gaza, the cries of pain and loss were mixed with a burst of joy. Similar celebrations broke out in the West Bank cities of Ramallah and Al-Khalil.
We praise the Palestinian resistance and we support Al-Qassam brigades who captured this soldier. And this is great news as the Zionist offensive is going on in Gaza. This is great news to our prisoners that they will become free soon.
This is an honor to the Palestinian nation and victory to the Palestinian nation. We are proud of the men of the resistance as well as all of the Palestinians.
We are celebrating the capture of this Zionist who came to Gaza to kill children and massacre civilians. We all support the resistance and hopefully more Israeli soldiers will be captured.
The capture of one soldier has countered the relentless bombardment of Gaza and dealt a severe blow to the Israeli occupation forces. It also gives the Palestinians leverage in any future negotiations with the Israelis.
While Gaza burns from the brutal Israeli aggression, it seems that the Palestinian resistance has dug out a potential game changer from the rubble left in the wake of the Zionist onslaught. The capture of Shaul Aron, an Israeli soldier, sent shockwaves through the ranks of the Zionist military machine. It also dented the morale of the elite Golani brigade, which was pillaging and committing massacres in the Shuja'iyya neighborhood of Gaza City. The Palestinian resistance braved the bombs falling indiscriminately on the neighborhood, killed 20 of the Israeli supposedly top military force, and took the soldier hostage. The bold operation was carried out by Hamas's military wing as did Din al-Qassam, giving the resistance the upper hand in any future ceasefire negotiations. Not only will Hamas demand the release of more detainees in Israeli jails, like they managed in 2011 when the Israelis caved to mounting pressure and released more than 1,000 Palestinians in exchange for Gilad Shalit after 5 years in captivity. Hamas can also put forth their conditions to implement a ceasefire, including opening the border crossings for much-needed supplies of goods and medicine for the besieged Gaza Strip. Now the ball is in the Israeli court, and a quick response is needed since it is becoming impossible to maintain the status quo of barbaric ground operation against Gaza, with more soldiers in danger of being taken captives by Palestinian resistance groups.
The top Hamas leader in the Gaza Strip, Ismail Haniyeh, signaled that the Palestinian resistance will not agree to an unconditional ceasefire with Israelis. Haniyeh said that the aim of the current battle is to break a 7-year-old blockade of the Palestinian territory. Haniyeh said in a televised speech that all of Gaza's 1.7 million residents shared this demand.
We cannot go back. We cannot go back to the silent death of the blockade. Gaza has decided to end the blockade by its blood and courage. This siege, this unjust siege, must be lifted. The occupation has failed in its aerial assault, and that is why it turned to a ground invasion. A ground invasion means that the enemy is persistent in its terrorism. Gaza is a cemetery for the invaders, and it lies on the bridge to the freedom of our people and their return from exile.
International bodies are ramping up efforts to end the war on Gaza. The diplomatic undercurrent has seen US Secretary of State John Kerry dispatched to Cairo and Palestinian leaders reading to discuss a truce in Doha.
Secretary Kerry to the rescue, again, or so it seems. As Washington's closest ally continues to pound the Gaza Strip relentlessly, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is heading back to the Middle East in a bid to boost efforts to reach a ceasefire between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
So Secretary Kerry will meet with allies and partners. I've instructed him to push for an immediate cessation of hostilities based on a return to the November 2012 ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
The U.S. has devotedly defended the Israeli entity in its confrontations with the Palestinians, that is, on air.
It's a hell of a pinpoint operation. It's a hell of a pinpoint operation.
In between interviews, Kerry made a mic gaffe as he criticized Israeli brutality, but soon took it back after he was confronted by a Fox News presenter.
We've got to get over there. Thank you, John. I think, John, we ought to go tonight. I think it's crazy to be sitting around.
And Kerry will be back. The U.S. Secretary of State is set to arrive in Cairo, where Egyptian mediators came up with the so-called peace initiative that failed to take account of the Palestinians' demands and was therefore rejected by Hamas. Egypt, however, has recently expressed willingness to amend its proposal to accommodate Hamas by adding some of its conditions. That is, if all involved sides consent to this. Speaking of Hamas, the Palestinian resistance group's chief Khalid Mash'al was to meet with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in Qatar to lay out the conditions for a ceasefire with the Israelis. Abbas on Sunday met with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani as part of a Middle East tour in his quest to find a solution to the bloody conflict.
I know that while I was en route to Doha, dozens more civilians, including children, have been killed in Israeli military strikes in the Shejaiya neighborhood in Gaza. I condemn this atrocious action. Israel must exercise maximum restraint and do far more to protect the civilians.
I call on everyone to be responsible and keep the Palestinians away from regional and international rivalries. I stress again the importance of commitment to the Egyptian initiative for ceasefire to stop the bloodshed.
Now, with international efforts intensifying to end the war on Gaza, the question remains as to whether the Qatar versus Egypt row will in fact bring peace back to Gaza or only extend the conflict to a diplomatic level.
Political analyst Nabil Khalil joins us now from our Beirut studios. Mr. Khalil, have the tables really turned on the Israelis since their soldier was taken hostage? Let's not forget that in 2011, the Israelis released over 1,000 Palestinians in return for only one soldier.
Actually, it is not the only issue that brings Israelis to their knees in this war against Gaza. It's the resistance of all Palestinian people in Gaza against the atrocity that had been committed against civilians, all kinds of civilians, hospitals, schools, residence area, and still the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people is still resisting as much as the resistance itself, by itself. These new kind of operation behind the enemy's lines, these operations that took the enemies on surprise and took some real casualties among them that bring more than 25 as Israeli sources recognize, and nearly 40 Israeli killed soldiers from Golani, which is the best trained soldiers in Israel. This operation that is the one and the first of their kind in the war against Israel and the war against the Israeli atrocity in Gaza and against Palestinian people. This is the situation that brings Israel to their knees, and not only the capture of these Israeli soldiers.
So is the Palestinian desire for an end to the siege going to be put on the table now with these new developments? What sort of leverage are we looking at here?
Actually, Israel's diplomacy is working hard with the international partners and their international supporters, United States and the some of the Western countries, and even most of the Arab worlds supporting Israel attack against the Palestinians. Yet, despite of all of this, the situation of Israelis are not letting them to go ahead with this losing situation. They couldn't stop the rockets launching against the cities of Israel. They couldn't make any issue against what they call the tunnels situation in Palestine. And they couldn't make any advance in their war. All they did was losing and wasting efforts and the image of Israel as well in the international arena, as much as losing one of their best soldiers and best forces in Palestine. Therefore, it's obvious that they will call for a ceasefire, and they are ready now to give up many of their demands on the Palestinian arena.
Is there any going back on the part of the Israelis now that they have entered Gaza and committed countless massacres? What does this do to their image?
Well, internationally, we have seen demonstration not only on the street of cities of international arena. We haven't seen this only in the West world and West capitals. We have seen this even in the media. 90% of the articles that had been written, even in mainstream media, we have seen it against the atrocity that been committed by Israeli forces against civilians in Palestine. This is very bad situation for the image of Israel. We can say that this is the worst situation that Israel had got since 2006 in their war against the Palestinians and against the resistance of the area.
Do you think the failure of any agreement is essentially pinned on the West's and regional failure to treat the Palestinian resistance as an actor in this conflict? Can the Palestinian Authority really act as a genuine broker?
I believe that this war against the Palestinians, the resistance of the people, and it's not only the resistance of the people of Gaza and West Bank and the Palestinian territory occupied in 1948, as much as the Palestinian in refugees camp and the people of the many of the Arab and Muslims country. This support can show that Palestinians can play a role, and the resistance in the region can play much better and much advanced role in the near future and in the long-term policy in the area.
All right, political analyst Nabil Khalil, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. You're watching Ali Tijah World News, still to come. The Russian military unveils some of its findings about the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. More on that after the break. Welcome back to Ali Tijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Israelis carry out fresh massacres in Gaza as the Palestinian body count climbs to 572. The Palestinian resistance kills another 15 enemy combatants, bringing the total to 35 Israeli soldiers dead and 1 captured. The top Hamas official Ismail Haniyeh says that the aim of the current battle is to break the 7-year-old Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip. And talk of a compromise. Diplomatic efforts to end the Israeli aggression on Gaza are stepped up. Kiev has launched a heavy assault on the rebel-held city of Donetsk as international investigators arrived in the region to examine the remains of people killed in the downing of a Malaysia Airlines flight. Separatist leader Sergei Kavtaradze said Ukrainian government forces led by tanks and armoured vehicles are trying to break into Donetsk, and fighting was underway near the city's railway station. It is the heaviest outbreak of violence in the region since the MH17 airliner was shot down on Thursday. US President Barack Obama urged his Russian counterpart to use his influence to get pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine to stop tampering with the Malaysian flight investigation.
Now, Russia has extraordinary influence over these separatists. No one denies that. Russia has urged them on. Russia has trained them. We know that Russia has armed them with military equipment and weapons, including anti-aircraft weapons. Key separatist leaders are Russian citizens. So, given its direct influence over the separatists, Russia, and President Putin in particular, has direct responsibility to compel them to cooperate with the investigation. That is the least that they can do. President Putin says that he supports a full and fair investigation. And I appreciate those words, but they have to be supported by actions. The burden now is on Russia to insist that the separatists stop tampering with the evidence, grant investigators who are already on the ground immediate, full, and unimpeded access to the crash site.
The diplomatic row over the downing of the Malaysian airliner MH17 is escalating as the UN Security Council voted on a resolution that condemns the downing of the plane and called for the perpetrators to be held accountable. Meanwhile, the Russian military has come out with fresh evidence that raises serious questions as to who was behind the deadly incident.
As the diplomatic fallout from the MH17 crash escalates, the Russian military said it had detected a Ukrainian Su-25 fighter jet gaining height towards the Malaysian airliner on the day of the catastrophe.
A Ukraine Air Force military jet was detected gaining height. Its distance from the Malaysian Boeing was 3 to 5 kilometers. We would like to get an explanation as to why the military jet was flying along a civil aviation corridor at almost the same time and at the same level as a passenger plane.
This comes as a 15-member UN Security Council unanimously passed a resolution condemning the shooting down of the passenger plane in eastern Ukraine, demanding those responsible be held accountable, and calling on armed groups in the east not to compromise the crash site's integrity. But Moscow is skeptical for a good reason. The downing of the Malaysian airliner has given Western governments a golden opportunity to mount more pressure on the Russian Federation over its stance on Ukraine. Now the US and its allies appear set to use the Security Council as leverage to up the ante.
We can say with certainty that if military actions in eastern Ukraine had not resumed on June 28, this tragedy would most likely not have occurred. Absolutely everything must be done for their full security and to guarantee the humanitarian corridors necessary for their work. With that said, nobody has the right to use this tragedy for their narrow, selfish political ends.
According to a former senior advisor to OSCE, the blame game against Russia that unfolded in Western media hours after MH17 crash in Ukraine has only political motives behind it. He also stressed that collective evidence for such an incident takes weeks and months, and that everything else is jumping to conclusions.
Let's now speak to Charles Shoebridge. He is a security analyst. Mr. Shoebridge, before any investigation has begun, some had already pinned the blame on Moscow, which really questions whether there was a motive behind the downing of this plane.
Well, yes, for some, this coincidence of great pressure on Russia via the West media and via West politicians might suggest that there was an ulterior motive to the shooting down. For example, some have suggested that this would be a good example of a Ukrainian false flag operation. But I think that it's far more likely, although that's a possibility, it's far more likely that this is indeed a tragic accident as takes place in war. If one thinks back to similar situations, 2001, Ukraine shot down a Russian airliner. Of course, there's a very famous or infamous example from 1988, the US shooting down of an Iranian airliner by the USS Vincennes with nearly 300 dead, again ruled to be an accident in the end. In war zones or combat zones, accidents happen, and of course, if civilian airliners are being allowed to fly over these areas, as the Ukraine government allowed them to do prior to this incident taking place, it's almost certain at some point that accidents or near misses will take place.
But can we be sure that any investigation into the killings will be in fact objective?
Well, we can't be, except that observers on the ground need to be present from all countries, including Russia. And remember, Russia is a member of the OSCE, that these people are there to observe that the process is fair. It's interesting that whilst the West media, for example, has been very critical of the rebels and indeed the local people in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, in their handling of this crash so far, it's got to be remembered that this is a war zone. There is no functioning government in these areas. It's ungoverned space. And it might be said, on the other hand, that local people have done what they can to preserve the dignity of the dead, but at the same time making some effort to preserve the crash scene. A lot of the evidence, remember, in this case will be coming from outside the site itself. For example, radar tracks should be able to show potential missiles, as indeed radio transmissions. But all of these need to be confirmed, independently corroborated. And of course, it's very much open to the West, to NATO in particular, that has quite comprehensive coverage electronically of this area of Ukraine, to release what it knows about what went on in the same way as Russia claims to have done with its evidence that it's produced today.
The question that many are still pondering on is why the plane was diverted right for a military zone.
Well, it's a good point, although of course it's also worth noting that whereas some airlines, I understand British Airways amongst other major airlines, had for some time avoided this area, that it's also the case that not just Malaysian Airlines but others as well were still flying through it. And of course one has to look there possibly for savings in fuel, in time, profit at the end of the day, putting passengers at risk. But as I say, Malaysian Airlines wasn't the only one, and of course they would say if Ukraine kept the airspace open, then they are entitled to fly there. We must also remember, I think, that minor deviations to height and to route, even at the last minute, are not exactly unexpected in international air travel. But nonetheless, until there's a properly independently scrutinised and supervised international inquiry into this matter, the cause of this crash, even really technically as to whether it was actually even shot down at all, remains very much open. And people should reserve their judgment until more evidence becomes independently confirmed and actually is publicly released.
All right, security analyst Charles Shoebridge, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. In its latest report, the International Atomic Energy Agency said that Iran has diluted its entire stock of medium-enriched uranium, as required under a November deal reached between Tehran and the P5+1. As talks to reach a comprehensive nuclear deal with Iran were extended beyond an initial July 20th deadline, the UN nuclear watchdog announced that Tehran was standing by its international commitments.
And have worked together on
In a letter to his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, Syria's Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim said that the Syrian government believes its victory over the armed insurgency is assured thanks to Moscow and the support of other allies. Muallim said that Syria's unwavering confidence in its victories thanks to its people's resistance and to the support of its friends, especially Russia, adding that the leaders and people of Syria are respectful and full of gratitude for Russia's stance. Well, the Syrian army has successfully fought off yet another infiltration attempt by militants in the capital, Damascus. The operation, which left dozens of foreign insurgents dead, is only the latest in a string of infiltration attempts by the militant groups over the course of the last 4 days.
Artillery shelling rings out from a distance, with clashes raging day and night. This is the district of Jobar, Damascus's eastern gate, where heavy clashes have been taking place between the Syrian armed forces and several foreign-backed militant groups. In a desperate attempt to reach the capital, hundreds of gunmen launched attacks earlier on numerous army checkpoints located in the area surrounding Jobar and the Abbasid Square, one of Damascus's Christian majority areas. The gunmen fell short of completing their mission as they were pushed back by army units backed by tanks and armored vehicles. Syrian troops, meanwhile, stormed some of the insurgents' hideouts in deserted buildings.
Thank God we stopped a militant push towards the capital, Damascus, with the efforts of our brave soldiers who have put the safety of the country as their first priority.
Militant positions in Jobar have long been the target of artillery shelling and ground operations, but given the fact that they always use civilians as human shields, they have so far evaded deadly strikes. It's not the first time that militants try to shift the battle into Damascus. Several attempts were thwarted in the past, all ending in a crushing blow for the insurgent groups.
The Iraqi army is closer to regaining the militant-held city of Tikrit, with troops now in full control of villages and the outskirts of the provincial capital. Wissam al-Bayati has the full story.
As the Iraqi security forces is continuing the regaining of the territories controlled by the Islamic State in the province of Salah ad-Din, the Iraqi army, backed with the volunteers, have successfully imposed its full control on the villages and towns in the outskirts of the city of Tikrit. According to the Iraqi top security officials, the military confrontation and clashes lasted more than 9 hours and ended with killing and arresting tens of militants and regaining all the villages and towns around the city of Tikrit by the Iraqi security forces. After establishing the forward military operation bases in these towns to contain the counterattacks, the Iraqi army deployed snipers on the rooftops and increased the posts of the machine guns to strengthen its grip on the regained sites.
According
to our headquarters, the militants are preparing for a counterattack. I am here waiting, and I wish to see them coming. I'm sure that they will think twice before taking such counteroffensive.
Meanwhile, many other officers said that they can see the militants from their positions, adding that the militants are surrounded in 1 or 2 places and are waiting for the new orders to take the militants out from the area.
I can see the militants from my site. They are surrounded in 1 or 2 neighborhoods. We can take them out easily, but we are waiting for the new instructions and orders.
According to the high-ranking military officials, the Iraqi army used new warfare tactics and expanded the scale of weaponry and ammunition beside the air support by the Iraqi Air Force. They say that the next hours will witness very important progress against the militants in Salah ad-Din province. Wissam al-Bayati, Al-Ittijah, Baghdad.
So-called Islamic State militants in Iraq have resorted to mass killings of minority groups. Those suffering most belong to the Christian, Turkmen and Shabak communities. Rehab Rikabi has more.
The mass killing, kidnapping and threatening religious and ethnic minorities in Iraqi militant-held territories have terrified the civilians and forced them to leave behind everything to survive. The Christians, among many other religious communities, have streamed out of the northern Iraqi city of Mosul and its villages after Islamic State affiliates ordered them either to embrace Islam and live under the Islamic State terms or to leave the city, otherwise they will face death sentence. As a result, tens of thousands of Christian families have fled their cities to settle in the Khazar refugee camp in Iraqi semi-autonomous Kurdistan region. The United Nations has condemned Islamic State brutality against Iraqi civilians, and the UN Assistant Mission for Iraq, UNAMI, reported that the Islamic State extremist militants in Iraq are executing many civilians in public based on their religious and ethnic affiliations, further adding that the Islamic State members are recruiting children by force and raping women among acts that amounted to war crimes. Meanwhile, Iraqi government deplores the forcible expulsion being undertaken by Islamic State and other extremist groups against Iraqi Christians and other communities including Yazidis, Turkmen and Shabaks. Iraqi politicians have also condemned the international community for its silence on the violence against Iraqi minorities.
The problem with what's happening now in northern Iraq, in particular Mosul, with the displacement of hundreds of thousands, beginning with the Turkmen, the Shia Turkmen, then followed now by the Arab Shiites, and now followed by the Christians. And the unfortunate event is that the silence of the United States against all this, and insisting that any assistance will not happen in Iraq unless there is a fundamental change in politics in Iraq.
Furthermore, Iraqi Christians and other minorities in the capital Baghdad and other provinces have expressed their deep concerns of the fragile security situation. They further urge the central government and international community to halt immediately this terror campaign by Islamic State militants against their communities.
The militants are threatening Iraq's Christian communities all over the country, and they have ordered us to leave the country. We have been left with no other choice but to urge the government and UN to protect us against the genocide, which is aimed to eliminate our traces in Iraq.
In that regard, experts are agreeing that the current frequency of militancy and the terrorist threats may destroy the entire political process in Iraq, stressing that the politicians have to give this issue the top priority in their agenda. As the UN Refugee Agency has reported lately that more than 1.2 million people have been internally displaced since violence escalated last month.
The growing threat by Islamic State included all Iraqi spectrums and damaged the harmony of Iraqi society, something Iraqi government has been trying to avoid by deploying more troops. Meanwhile, many stress that the solution is political. Rehab Rikabi, Al Ittijah, Baghdad.
Here's a reminder of our top stories. The Israelis carrying out fresh massacres in Gaza as the Palestinian body count climbs to 572. The Palestinian resistance kills another 15 enemy combatants, bringing the total to 35 Israeli soldiers dead and 1 captured. The top Hamas official Ismail Haniyeh says that the aim of the current battle is to break the 7-year-old Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip. And talk of a compromise, diplomatic efforts to end the Israeli aggression on Gaza are stepped up. Well, that's all from me and the Al Ittijah News team. Thank you for watching and good night.